In her life of service, we saw that abiding love of tradition, together with that fearless embrace of progress, which makes us great as nations.
The silence wasn't peaceful, it was strategic. And behind those palace walls, something explosive was already in motion. Because while the world was distracted by legacy, ceremony, and whispers of remembrance, Prince William was allegedly drawing a line so sharp it would cut his own brother out of the royal story entirely. What if the real story was never about family drama, but about control? About power quietly shifting hands while no one was watching? Because the moment King Charles III stepped back, not publicly, not dramatically, but almost invisibly, everything changed. No announcement, no warning, just a quiet withdrawal that felt almost too calm, too deliberate. And that's where the suspicion begins, because when power disappears silently, it doesn't vanish, it moves. And insiders claim it moved directly into the hands of William, and not just him, but a tightly controlled circle forming what some are calling an iron structure inside the monarchy, a structure that wasn't built overnight but activated at exactly the right moment. Why then? Why now? Why just before a milestone tied to Queen Elizabeth II, a moment meant to symbolize unity, unless unity was already broken? Look closer. The king, reportedly overwhelmed by pressure, health whispers growing louder, emotional strain tightening its grip, chooses not to fight the storm, but to step out of it. That's not surrender, that's strategy. Because by stepping back, he didn't lose control, he redefined it. He handed the most volatile issue, the one name echoing through every corridor, every headline, every uncomfortable silence, directly to William. And suddenly, the tone changed. No more hesitation, no more diplomatic balancing acts. This wasn't about smoothing things over anymore. This was about drawing boundaries, hard ones, permanent ones. Because for William, this wasn't just a family disagreement. This was something deeper, something almost ideological, a belief, a principle, a warning. Royal titles, in his eyes, weren't symbols to be used, they were responsibilities to be lived. And once those lines start blurring, once titles begin to mix with branding, deals, influence, something sacred starts to shift. And that shift, that's what he couldn't ignore. So when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped into that in-between space, not fully inside the monarchy, not fully outside it, it created something dangerous. Not chaos, not rebellion, something worse, confusion. Because confusion weakens structure, and structure is everything. That's when the quiet adjustments began. Not loud, not public, but precise. Internal policies tightening, oversight increasing, invisible lines being drawn where none existed before. And out of that silence, a rule emerged. No more half in, half out. You're either in or you're out. And if that sounds harsh, that's because it is. But harsh doesn't mean impulsive. It means calculated. Because William wasn't reacting, he was preparing for a monarchy that couldn't afford mixed signals anymore. Preparing for a future where loyalty wasn't assumed, it was defined. And then came the breaking point. March 2026. Behind closed doors at Windsor, a meeting that insiders say changed everything. No cameras, no leaks, at least not immediately. But tension? That was undeniable. Because this wasn't about rumors anymore. This was about specifics, about names, about actions that, in William's view, crossed a line that should never have been touched. The continued use of royal titles in ways that blurred public duty with private gain. To some, harmless. To others, modern evolution. But to William, a direct threat. Because once a title becomes a tool, it stops being a duty. And that's when the conversation shifted from concern to action. Quietly, firmly, without spectacle. And here's where it gets even more unsettling, because the story we've all heard, the explosive narrative of a physical clash between the brothers fueled by spare, might not be the full truth, or maybe not the truth at all. What if the real fracture wasn't physical but emotional? What if the damage wasn't one moment but years of unresolved tension building beneath polite smiles and public appearances? Because new whispers suggest something different. Not a fight, but a collapse. A relationship slowly eroding under pressure, media scrutiny, conflicting loyalties, and one critical turning point, Harry's unwavering defense of Meghan. And that's where everything began to split. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, until there was nothing left holding them together. And maybe, just maybe, the ban that's now being whispered about, the alleged exclusion from Balmoral, the tightening access, the controlled silence, isn't a reaction to one event, but the final move in a strategy that's been unfolding for years. A strategy designed not to punish, but to protect. But protect what exactly? The monarchy? The legacy or something far more fragile, something already cracking beneath the surface? Because if this is truly about preserving the crown, then the question becomes even more uncomfortable. What had to be sacrificed to do it? And more importantly, who decided it was worth it? And this is where the story stops looking like a disagreement and starts feeling like a system locking itself down. Because what followed wasn't loud, emotional, or chaotic. It was colder than that, more precise, almost surgical. As summer approached, the monarchy didn't just react, it restructured itself. Not in speeches, not in statements, but in action so controlled, so deliberate that they barely made a sound, and yet they changed everything. This was the moment insiders began whispering about something they called the steel wall. Not a metaphor, not exaggeration. A real calculated separation built piece by piece, layer by layer, until there was no longer any confusion about where the line stood. Because confusion, as William had already decided, was the real enemy. And suddenly, patterns that once felt normal started to disappear. The familiar rhythm of royal summers, the gatherings, the shared spaces, the quiet family moments tucked away at Balmoral, all of it shifted. Not gradually, not subtly, but unmistakably. One presence was missing. Not by accident, not by oversight, by design. No invitation, no overlap, no maybe later, just absence. And that absence said more than any announcement ever could. Because this wasn't about ignoring someone, it was about redefining their place entirely. Behind the scenes, security protocols were adjusted with a level of detail that feels almost unsettling when you think about it. Access wasn't just limited, it was reclassified. A visit wouldn't be treated as family returning home, but as an external figure entering controlled territory. That's not distance. That's separation. Even communication, something as basic as human as conversation, became structured, narrowed, monitored. The kind of shift that doesn't just create space, it creates silence. And not the peaceful kind. The kind that makes you wonder what's being avoided and why. Because when a family stops speaking freely, something deeper has already broken. And standing quietly at the center of this controlled shift was Catherine, Princess of Wales. Not loud, not reactive, but firm in a way that feels almost immovable. She didn't escalate. She didn't soften. She aligned fully. And that alignment mattered more than it seemed, because it told the world this wasn't just William's stance, it was a united front. A front built not on emotion, but on protection. Protection of their children. Protection of their space. Protection of something that, from their perspective, had already been tested too many times. And here's the part that lingers. The part that doesn't sit comfortably, because there were moments, small, fleeting, almost invisible, where reconciliation seemed possible, where the idea of rebuilding something, anything, flickered for just a second. But every time it surfaced, it collided with the same fear: exposure. Because in a world where every glance becomes a headline, every meeting becomes a narrative, and every word gets twisted into speculation, even a private conversation could explode into something uncontrollable. Old wounds don't just reopen, they get broadcast. And that risk? Too high. So the wall stayed, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as something far more calculated, a shield, a way to keep stability intact while everything else felt uncertain. Because from the inside, this wasn't about pushing someone away, it was about holding everything else together. And that's when the story expands beyond family into something much bigger. Because by mid-2026, this wasn't just about two brothers drifting apart. It wasn't even just about Harry and Meghan anymore. It had become something symbolic, a divide, two completely different visions of what it means to be royal. On one side, independence, freedom, narrative control, a life where identity can be shaped, redefined, monetized even. A Martin approach that embraces influence, media, personal direction. It's flexible, it's evolving, it speaks the language of today. On the other side, something far more rigid, duty, structure, continuity, a system that doesn't bend easily because it was never designed to. A life where the individual dissolves into the role, where service comes before self every single time. And William, he chose his side. But more than that, he enforced it. Because in his mind, the monarchy cannot survive in fragments. It cannot exist in two versions at once. It cannot say one thing and represent another. Because the moment it does, belief starts to fade. And once belief fades, everything else follows. So the steel wall wasn't temporary. It wasn't emotional. It was foundational. A long-term strategy designed to eliminate ambiguity, to create clarity so sharp, so undeniable, that there would never again be a question of who stands where. Because uncertainty had already cost too much. And looming over all of this like a silent witness was the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. A legacy built on consistency, restraint, and a kind of quiet strength that never needed to prove itself. Her 100th birthday wasn't just a celebration, it was a reminder of what the monarchy was, of what it's supposed to be, and maybe of what it risks becoming. Because when you place that legacy next to the present moment, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Two paths, two identities, two completely different futures pulling in opposite directions. And standing at the center of that tension is William, not waiting, not hesitating, acting, making decisions that don't just affect relationships but redefine them. Decisions that don't just respond to the present but shape what comes next. Because this isn't about a single ban, a single exclusion, or a single moment. This is about a message that doesn't need to be spoken out loud because it's already being felt. The crown cannot be carried halfway. It doesn't adjust to comfort. It doesn't bend to personal preference. It demands everything or it takes nothing. And if someone chooses not to give everything, then the system adjusts accordingly. Even if that adjustment feels cold, even if it feels permanent, even if it means closing a door that once seemed impossible to shut. And that's the part no one can answer yet. The part still hanging in the air, unresolved, unfinished. Because if this wall was built to protect the monarchy, then what happens if it also becomes the thing that keeps a family from ever finding its way back?